I had the pleasure of having a deep conversation with Miguel Robles-Durán, who is professor of urbanism at the New School for Social Research. Now, the conversation reverted around how the framework of understanding housing as a supply problem, as the issue that indeed the supply is low. So, as neoclassical economists tell us, if we just raise the supply of housing, we'll resolve the issue, is deeply flawed. In fact, housing no longer serves as an instrument to house people, but has become an asset in the portfolio of the wealthy. I would love to get a sense from you about where does this financialization come from, how does it evolve, and ultimately how then we can connect this with the more general picture that shows us how financialization is not the exception from the norm as it's usually understood by mainstream economics, but actually an acceleration of processes that have a much deeper root.
Thank you very much, Clara. And I'm so glad that you are discussing this topic because, as you very much said, so normally, I guess, neoclassical economics or what would be mainstream economics, they only see these in the issues of housing or actually territory space itself as, statistics, numbers, and all of that. And they hardly discuss, if any, the political, I guess, processes in which many of the negative consequences of their making, I guess, mainstream economists, by focusing solely on the trade of commodities and all of that has engendered into an urban condition that I think is totally unsustainable. And it's not only New York City, as you mentioned, but it's around the world. It's very hard or difficult to date the financialization. When did it actually begin the way that we see it today? And I will try to explain a little bit what is it, how is it that we see it today. But a lot of people point out, and I've been more and more convinced that this might be a breaking point. In the early 80s, there was a meeting in Basel with the main bankers of the world, bank institutions in the world. That meeting in Basel is something that is well known. It happens often, and bankers just get together and decide how they're going to work together. And during that meeting, there was a decision that was highly consequential to what you're talking about. They made it possible to use housing as a collateral. Before that time, housing, this is 70s, 60s, whatever before that time, housing, yes, it was traded on the capitalist market. Yes, there was speculation, all of these things that we might be able to also talk about. But financialization as such started, or the idea of how can you financialize housing, when this group of bankers came together and decided that you can use it as a collateral. And basically what that means is that most banks are required to have X amount of liquid money in there as an asset so that they are able to loan another amount. And in that period, all the assets that the bank owned had to do with many other commodities, including, of course, money in the money form. But housing was just really out of the purview. Now, you could imagine how transformational this moment was because, you were telling banks, okay, you can use a portfolio of houses, right? Keep their value or whatever they're valued and use that as a collateral to lend more money to other people, right? This, of course, created many contradictions. Now, it didn't start very fast, and actually I would argue that the major development of financialization of housing happened after the 2007, 2008 financial crisis, in which, of course, the US had a lot of suffering. A lot of foreclosures and all of that happened. But during that period, of course, you had a lot of transformations with the neoliberal regime. A lot of policies changed to favor the privatization of many housing stocks, et cetera. And with that came, of course, more wealth. And with more wealth, as my dear friend David Harvey says, people that have a lot of money, you have to find places where to put it, right? always we think that urbanization is one of the main places that absorbs, excess capital or excess surplus, right? And these, of course, a big part of the city of urbanization is housing. And so a lot of things converge, between the 80s and, of course, the 2008 financial crisis. But majoritarily, it had to do with lending, right? And the capacity of banks of absorbing all the surplus that neoliberalism had been creating, which is unseen in any other previous epoch of humanity, right? I mean, the amount of wealth that has been generated over the last 40, 50 years. And so in the 2008 financial crisis, many companies, you mentioned BlackRock, I think, and Blackstone. Blackstone, owned by a big donor of Donald Trump, Eric Schwartzman, he kind of had an idea that, there's a lot of people that are being foreclosed, right? And that means that they don't have a means to pay it. They own a lot of debt. The banks don't know what to do with that excess of housing because there were a lot of huge portfolios in the United States and around the world. And they just said, well, what happens if we start buying that housing, right? And not sell it, keep it as an asset so that we can, continue to speculate on. And with that, came the idea that, well, perhaps we can just still rent it. And Blackstone was incredibly aggressive from that point on to develop what we think is the largest private housing portfolio in the world. In the US, they're number 3 because they've been operating in many places, like Barcelona suffered a lot from these, but there are many, many places around the world. But they use, as you read, 30, 40, 60,000 houses, 80,000 houses that they own in many countries. And what they do with these is they become assets of speculation, which is very good. But something that is very, very interesting, and I always try to tell people in relationship to how neoclassical economics looks at this. Neoclassical economics always looks at the housing problem from a supply and demand agenda, right? And I've been saying for several years already that supply and demand simply don't make sense in the contemporary, financialized agenda, because once you have a house as part of a collateral, or as part of an asset of an investment firm or a bank, then the housing has to always keep the value, right? No bank wants the housing to actually go down in value because, of course, they cannot lend as much, or they go into problems such as the 2008 financial crisis with Lehman Brothers and so forth. So the main agenda that we're talking about when we talk about financialization is the idea that housing purpose, or the purpose of housing, which before the 80s used to be to house us, right? To have a roof above us, to safeguard us from the elements, etc., to live a life. That use was no longer, or started not being, the primary aspect of what housing was. And this is really a radical shift, right? Like the purpose of housing today, as a consequence, of course, of all these histories and previous histories, is mainly an investment. And when you start seeing housing as an investment, you don't see it as something that people need, or that is, or it's a priority for people to be in a house. And then you start seeing it as something that is just there to make more money. With that said, one of the big issues that are happening today is precisely that the cost of housing is just going through the roof. Every year is just like new record. Currently, New York City, I believe, I might get this number wrong for some hundreds of dollars, but the average rental for a 1-bedroom in New York City is around $4,300 a month, right? Which is absolutely insane. Imagine the amount of money that you would have to earn to actually be able to afford a 1-bedroom apartment, right? And that is actually the main consequence of this. You have more and more housing being built, but the purpose of it is to keep it as a portfolio, as an asset. And I think a major consequence that we can all see, everybody can see for this, is that when you go to a lot of city centers, you would see that there are many empty spaces, right? There's like a lot of empty, blocks or empty apartments. David Harvey says that if you look at night in the skyline of New York City, you would see a lot of lights off, right? And that will tell you, that there's like this crazy amount of empty units. And the logic of supply and demand tells us that, the housing crisis happens because we don't have enough supply, right? And so if you provide more housing, if people start building more, this thing will just, neutralize. That's always the magical belief of the, neoclassical economist, which never happens by the way, but they still believe it, right? It's a fantasy in many ways. But the reality is that you can right now use housing empty and make perhaps even more money than if you have it full of people. And that is something that goes totally against the idea of supply and demand, right? Because yes, you can make more housing, but if you are not renting it, if you are not selling it, let's put it this way, into just a regular market, then how is it possible that you add and add and add and prices continue to go up and up and up? We saw this as a phenomenon in many cities, especially metropolises around the world, where you had, the construction of like fancy buildings, a lot of luxury housing, and there's a reason for these, right? They just were not sold. And what is even more crazy is that the prices haven't come down, right? And so all of these empty houses are just an asset in a portfolio. That's basically what I'm trying to answer in your question, is that you can make a lot of money from this. And this is something I think that Marx never imagined at some point, to be able to have fixed capital, in this case, which is, housing that always took long to, to build and long perhaps to sell, that it has become liquid, de facto liquid. You can purchase 10 houses, you can go to an asset manager, such as the ones you go, and that becomes some money in your portfolio where you can lend or get more money for that. And you don't need to rent it, you don't need to sell it, you don't need to go through any process, right? Just hold it there. And so you have an artificially inflated sort of asset that is, more and more and more expensive. And who knows if this could go on forever, right? But this is basically what the system needs to continue expanding. Yeah.
So it's really fascinating because we see how our economic system makes life easier and easier for the rich. And this actually goes against another myth of neoclassical economics, at least of the founders of neoclassical economics, which was all about the fact that those who were saving and investing should be compensated because of their capacity to endure more sacrifice in waiting and rationally being able to basically invest their resources. So the idea is that you are compensated for the risk, or anyway for the fact that you're willing to endure some form of duress. And what we see in real life is the exact opposite. The capital owners don't need to endure any duress, and actually that the system is catering to their ever greater enrichment with basically no effort at all. So I think this is fascinating because it brings us to think about the other side of the class relation, who are the workers, who instead have higher rents to pay but constantly lower wages, especially in the service economies that are developing. So here's where I would like to ask you why the Marxian framework is so relevant today. With David, you teach about capital and how it should be understood as really a social relation that is ultimately, though, a social relation that then shapes all aspects of our lives, including the urban space, and thus like really our environments and not only our behavior. So how can we understand this process of extreme financialization in connection with the deeper roots of the problem that so often neoclassical economics misses?
Yeah, it's a great question. I commonly refer to, this is going to sound very nerdish, but anyway, this is where we're at. I commonly refer to Volume 1 of Marx Capital. If one gets to read that book, which by the way I recommend everyone reads it, I mean, it's a very sad situation that most people around the world have been, like, as brainwashed to see that that is totally, I don't know, like an evil, right? I mean, if anything, that book, as you know, is just the explanation of what capital does, right? There's no like evil thing, anything. And it's, in my view, still the most thorough explanation of capital till today. And it is very relevant. Now, in that volume, in the volume 1, Marx is a difficult read, especially by the middle of that volume 1, because he's talking numbers and relationships and abstract concepts come along, even though he uses real world examples, but he's always discussing abstract concepts and concepts that obviously he generated, use values, exchange values, diminishing returns, and all of those type of things, which for a general reader are very difficult to understand. And at some point in chapter 25 of that book, he basically says the following: look, you can know capital, or how capital works, by understanding all of these abstractions, right? But he barely says, but there's an easier way to do this. Like, the only thing you have to do is look at the housing of the poor, right? As a trained urbanist, which who knows what that means, right? As a person that really looks in the space, the production of space, my main interest has always been how capital materializes in space. And as I started growing more and more into, liking this or approaching more of this, I now say that the city or space or the urbanization is nothing but the material representation of capital. And that is what is my obsession with urbanization or with cities, right? Is I don't like cities because, they're pretty, of course. It's nice that they're pretty and there's nice with these. But it's just seeing how capital materializes, because at some point, all of these abstract numbers, right? All of these assets, all of these hedge fund names or futures, or all of these has to, enter our material world. And we cannot forget that that was mostly what Marx was arguing, which is from a material philosophy, right? And I think that one disservice that was done, especially in the early 20th century, was that most people took out of that material aspect, the material philosophy, out of Marxism, right? It's very difficult to talk about when you look at old school, intellectuals on Marxism. They don't talk about material realities. It's all abstractions now. Now, the relevance of Marxian, lines of understanding is that Marx doesn't see the commodities as the issue, right? As you know, neoclassical economics focuses on the commodity trade in the specific end product, and ignores the process on which that end product, is produced. It happens. In a Marxist framework, as we'll know, he focuses a lot on labor. But beyond that, which might be one of the biggest differences from neoclassical economics to Marxian economics, the addition of people as a thing, the material reality of people, the suffering of those that produce those commodities in which capitalists can actually make money out of, all the concepts of exploitation and all of these things that we know that Marx talks about, alienation, etc. But in the main frame, what Marx actually talks about is the process of capital, right? And when we talk about housing today, I am convinced that we cannot discuss any future of housing if we don't understand the process that produces the conditions in which we are. And there is by no means classical or neoclassical economics is able to explain this. Like, simply, it is not. I've read a lot of things on that, and I'm just like, well, you're not explaining me anything. You're explaining me how I make more money, how I exploit more people, how, commodities move around, but you are not understanding the process in which this happens. And this is basically what many of us that consider ourselves, Marxian, urbanist, or whatever you want to say, try to bring into the forefront. It is not a matter of becoming like a Marxist per se, but Marx gives us a framework to understand the process. And what we need to transform is the process, is not the end product. Again, it's not the supply and demand. I mean, the issue here is not the final housing, it's how we produce the housing and what are the mechanisms that allow us to produce the current models of housing that we're at.
Fascinating, Miguel. So the fact that we should focus on the process rather than the end point. And ultimately, that is all about the critique of Marxism. I mean, it is all about the critique that Marx makes to bourgeois economics, because we shouldn't focus on the object, the only thing that is visible, but actually on the social processes that enable that very object to even come out in the first place. So that a commodity is only what we see and what we relate to immediately, but behind it there are all these processes that involve, of course, unpaid labor from the part of the worker, involve social hierarchies, but involve also much more. So can you tell us a little bit more about how we should understand this process of capital that you have been explaining to us in very simple terms so that it becomes clear and more concrete?
So under capital, again, from a Marxian perspective, the main objective of, if one would ask me, what is capital about, I would say it's about the accumulation of surplus. I mean, I also would say that it's about death, but that's something to be discussed, I guess, in another podcast. But it's the accumulation of surplus is always the sort of the main engine that comes out of a capitalist social relationship, right? And I always like to see, if we talk about housing, if we start from the end point, which is the goal is surplus accumulation, profit, you can go back and back and back into the many sort of instances or many relationships or I guess from a dialectical perspective, the many situations that have to be put together so that you can realize this profit. Now, for a capitalist to realize its profit, of course, we can always talk about exploitation, right? And that means that there's a bunch of workers, not only on site, but also the ones that produce the material that is needed to build the housing, right? Also the ones that work on the transportation industry that needs to transport those materials, right? And we can also add to that the plundering of natural resources, right, in order to get those materials and that, which has also caused a major, as we know, a crisis of the environment. So I always like to tell about the process is that it's a way of looking at all of the relationships that have to come together in order for the capitalist to make a profit out of selling that end product. Now, and of course, it doesn't end there. Once the capitalist has that profit, it goes into this reinvestment, right, into these other forms of realization of money and redistribution and in what is a capitalist cycle. So as we focus on it's profit, so what happens before that? We can dissect many of the elements that go all the way into, I think, the basis of these, which is perhaps the capitalist state, the state in general. Like you were mentioning the state just before, and I always tell people that we have to remind ourselves that the current state formation came out of specific revolutions that were won by the capitalist, I guess, class, so in this case, the bourgeoisie, right? And therefore, the objective of the state is to create a climate in which the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, could actually, function as capitalists, right? I mean, we still, until today, we hear a lot of politicians argue that the state has to, the purpose of the state is to enable people to make profit, right? And well, we have had almost 3 centuries of that kind of development. And so I try to look at the first processes, at the laws and regulations that dictate how housing is traded within humans and constitutions. Obviously, one of the first ones is how much we have enshrined private property, right? And private property relationships, the way that people believe in it, the way that people are also allowed to destroy it. When I talk about environmental issues, that, I guess, Roman law inheritance in which private property gives you the right to destroy your property and nobody can say anything about it because it's your property, you can destroy it. That also enables all the mining necessary, all the products that are necessary in order to create, the built environment that we have. And once we look at the laws that enable, and not only enable, but really empower, right, the capitalist class that wants to do something in the built environment, we then move on, of course, into the conditions that also those laws allows the exploitation of individuals, right? The salary worker. Which is not normally a salary worker. Sometimes, in many cases, a lot of slave labor, even today, is being used. For example, most of Dubai, those that know a little bit about Dubai, has been built on slave labor, or kind of a modern type of slave labor. And you can go into the conditions in which people are exploited and treated and made live in camps and remove of any rights, especially on these countries, on many countries. And then also the salaried workers and all the systems that are necessary to actually end with a product that, again, makes profit. So for many of us, that process, the process that we talk about, is that for us to change the modality in which housing is received and perceived and traded amongst people, we cannot focus on housing itself. And this might sound for a lot of the audience a bit like nonsensical, right? You're talking about housing, well, you should focus on housing. My argument is that no, focusing on housing, on the actual object of housing, should be the last thing that we should focus on. What we should be focused on is how to change the many instances of these processes that permit housing to be such I guess, exploitative and exclusive and profit-making commodity. So I would rather say, let's focus on the legal apparatus and work with people there to change certain moments in which less exploitation is possible, in which perhaps you can call for the creation of collective property rights rather than private property rights. So a new form of property relationship can be potentialized, could be created. And so this is what I mean for the process, right? That focusing on the end, I think, on the end product is a mistake, actually.
That is really fascinating. And so how is it that ultimately, though, the struggles that emerge out of the right to housing can then be brought to operate upon something deeper and thus change how even the state relates to the economy in a way that is actually more representative of people? Of course, this would mean also rethinking the capitalist state into something that is actually capable of delivering instead a different economy. So I wanted to ask you, I know you've been active in many concrete and political struggles, and I know that you like to go back to the city you were born in, Mexico City, and lately you've been collaborating more than ever with the current Mexican government. If you can tell us a little bit about how what is happening there can be of inspiration for struggles more globally.
Definitely. I mean, I think before approaching these, it's very important to understand that when we talk about housing, we talk about different temporary instances, or I guess urgencies. By saying that we should focus on the process is not saying that, people need housing now. There's, like Rob Robinson did in your interview with him, he said, there's a lot of people without housing, and that's an emergency, and somebody has to actually be able to supply that housing. So when we start working or when we do something in praxis, with government officials or people that are involved in this, mostly governments that we work with, we not only focus on a process which we know will take a middle time framework. It's not something that will happen immediately, or also a long-term, agenda, which is something we always love to think about. But you also have to integrate, fast I guess, forms of ameliorating the conditions that most people are suffering. But what I guess it disturbs me, or it doesn't excite me when a lot of housing movements and a lot of people involved in the housing agendas around the world stop at just the provision of that house, right? And so when we decided to start Urban Front, which is an organization that started to be discussed with David Harvey. Both of us were asked by the president of Ecuador in the mid-2010s to help him develop a research center in Ecuador. That was Rafael Correa. And we agreed to do that. And we experienced a lot the possibility of being in touch directly with government officials that had decision-making power, let's say, which was very different with my previous experience with cohabitation strategies, which was mostly working on the grassroots level. And the formation of Urban Front was really as an organization that could mediate between those two, I guess, very separate agendas, the top-down governmental decisions, and then, of course, the grassroots conditions. Now, when we work again with the government, we try to look at those positions. From a grassroots level, people tend to organize because they need something now, right? And so you have to support the government into actually the production of a lot of housing. So for example, in Mexico that you mentioned, the current president, Claudia Sheinbaum, promised 1 million houses within her, mandate, which is last 6 years, right? Now, that scale is insane. I mean, like when you talk about 1 million houses, it's not exactly China scale, but it's getting you closer to a Chinese scale. It's a lot of housing. And to do that in a period of 6 years, it's a lot. Now, one thing that we have been doing is to support them by developing mechanisms and structures that could allow them to produce this amount of housing that they promised now, which we believe is necessary, right? And so one is just complying or working at the short term, which is this. But the main interest of us in Urban Front is really to work in the medium term and long term, which is trying to convince the government to modify specific legal structures, to develop new normatives, and to experiment with other forms of dwelling, of housing, right? And convince them, but this government didn't need much convincing because most of them comes from social movements anyway, but it's how within that provision of 1 million houses, we can insert other things that are not the 1 million houses on their private property, on the regular capitalist, forms of economy. And so we have been working very hard to instate cooperative laws and collective property laws, which is what we have been, what I've said before. We have also been working in developing economic models on how these work, and also new models that the president is calling for, which are related to social rent. Now, social rent is a very different concept that would be, I guess, public housing, right? And so what kind of concept is that? Because the desire of the government is to do this, right? Yes?
The question is, so the 1 million houses would be public houses, or would it be private, like houses in the hands of people directly? What was the form, and how are these different forms? What concretely do they offer in terms of also different speciality and different social relations?
I mean, the very first thing that the government decided to do was to, we're going to build these 1 million houses, but we're not going to do it as, they had done it before, which has been absolutely destructive form in the neoliberal times in Mexico. Actually, not too long ago, there was a production of these cookie cutter style houses, just one after another, kind of American suburbia, but perhaps in a more reduced thing, but similar concept, which was environmentally like horrific, transportation didn't work, etc. And many of these houses have been abandoned because they just don't work. So we have like thousands and thousands of houses in the peripheries, which are just ghost towns. And the government decided that, okay, we're going to do this now. We're going to take property from downtown areas, from central areas, and we're going to actually say that the poor population, or the people that don't have a lot of money, have also the right to live in the center of the cities, right? Which previously, or I guess during neoliberal times, it had become a right of only rich people, right? Only those that have the proximity to things. So this was, I guess, it's part of the major transformations that they're offering. So they have been purchasing and also expropriating land in city centers all over different cities in Mexico to be able to do these, right? They also decided to build...
And then they rent it?
Well, I'm getting there to the modalities. The majority of these properties, of these million homes, will definitely be destined to a regular property system, right? And people would say, well, then it's not so much of a difference. I am a believer that like an instant change, especially in society, Mexican society, American society, where they don't have in the psyche or in the mental collective living, especially the urban, right? In the rural areas, there's a lot of collective. It would be very disruptive. I mean, to suddenly say all of you would have to live in collective living, which nobody wants, first of all, because nobody knows what it is. And so we have been working with the government, especially the Secretary of Development, of Urban Development, that part of these, a percentage of these million homes, will be destined to new forms of property that are non-speculative, that they're not allowed speculation. And with that, they also started to think, okay, if we give it to a regular property market, let's say private property, is there a form that these houses can also be locked out of speculation, right? That to do a limited speculation, all the houses that the government actually gave through some kind of finance apparatus. The government is also setting up a bank that charges zero interest rate for those that want these new homes or that need these new homes. So there are still like major transformations that are within still the capitalist framework, but that are slowly moving, right, gradually into a more collectivized, less speculative model. Our standpoint working with governments has always been that any of these changes has to happen gradually. And so we are right now there invested, but not only there, in many other cities around the world, to do these changes or to apply changes that we know will have much more consequences in 10, 15, 20 years.
That is exceptionally interesting. Also because it shows you how by pushing the limits of what people can imagine participating in and achieving, this then pushes potentially to ask for more and better solutions. So you start with the state basically selling you a house at a price that is sustainable, but then you can also imagine, so you start thinking, well, I do have a right to housing, but then you realize that maybe the private property ownership is very limited for everyone, and then how then can we evolve into forms that are actually much more experimental in terms of communal housing. Yeah. So what does this cooperative housing really mean for people who don't know?
Yeah, I mean, I think a very important thing to mention or to add to what you were saying is that it's not only communal or collective or cooperative housing models, but we're talking about limited or no speculation on property, which that is an anti-capitalist proposition, right? Because you cannot make profit out of it. And so there's a lot of interest, of course, from us. We're many people in Urban Front. That's actually what we want to work with progressive governments to do. How can you create policy that does not permit speculation? Right. So with that said, cooperatives are, I guess, a model that has existed in many different variations. Even pre-capitalist, models have existed, which basically say that you don't own a property. The collective has the right to that property. It's not even discussing ownership anymore, right? It's discussing that the property is shared, right, and lived through collective decision making. And this, yes, it might sound like, oh, that sounds like a lot of work, right? But actually, it's not, because it creates a lot of solidarities within different communities. People have different responsibilities. They share responsibilities, which is also very important. And you're not dealing with, a lot of problems that arise from being an individual property owner, right? Which is not only psychological isolation, which is very big, and individualism that comes out of this, but it's also dealing with all the problems of your property by yourself and your family. And so there's a lot of support structures. There's, in the cooperative housings that we're talking about, there's collective units or spaces where people can cook together, do child rearing together, and so you don't need to take your baby to some place, right? And you can, the baby can stay there. And so there's so many beautiful benefits apart from the anti-capitalist, benefit of not, profiting from where you live.
Thank you, Miguel. You really walked us through how, from the systemic analysis of what the problems are, you can then also envisage or achieve tools to envisage concrete solutions. And the fact that actually operating within the capitalist system, you can push the logic of the system away by proposing transformations that really can start empowering people to imagine a different relation to housing no longer as a commodity that is ultimately a burden, also for the small property owner, of course, not for the big speculator, but ultimately housing as a space where we can rethink our humanity in a more collective way. So this is so interesting. We will have the luck of having with us Gabriela Rondon next for our last episode on housing, who will get into more details about the history of cooperatives and different housing forms that, again, are not science fiction. They have existed and they will exist, and hopefully they will be able to break through the limits of our current way of organizing society. Thank you, Miguel. You have a last word for us?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's been a very nice conversation. You mentioned that through housing there will be some social transformations, but again, I want to make reference on the idea that housing perhaps becomes the core of that material reality or the material, excess of capital today, right? I mean, it is at the core because it's where we live most of our lives, even though a lot of people sadly spend more time in their work right now than all of these. But we have to think of the spatial production of new forms of relationships and new relationships that will engender new forms of spatial production. I mentioned, of course, a lot of the processes that we can do or we can change or we can transform through legal apparatuses and economic conditions. But a very important thing that I didn't mention is that a beautiful thing about all of these cooperative, non-speculative forms of property that does thinking about it is that we're talking also about labor conditions. We're talking about social reproduction in general, right? Labor, there's a wonderful cooperative system in Uruguay, which I think is the best in the world, by the way, which is all around the idea that they are the ones that build their house. So you no longer exploit in the development of the house, right? You actually, whatever you sweat becomes part of it. So there's a lot of potential. The food production is tied to these, right? Secondary, tertiary economies, right? The production of handcrafts, the production of all kinds of necessary things and objects. And the ultimate fantasy, of course, is perhaps in 50, 60, 70 years, perhaps even more, that you would have international networks or transnational networks of cooperatives functioning so that they actually fall out of the capitalist trade system, so that they can actually, unite and work amongst themselves in a parallel world, to the capitalist enterprise. So yes, the idea is to work towards the erosion and the replacement of certain things that capitalism does for this new vision, this new way. And I think, if we all look this as a way forward, even though with all the mess of the world, I think there's a very positive outlook and outcome that could arise.
And I think there's so many lessons for economists, also young scholars in economics, to see how knowledge is really constructed by focusing on concrete potentialities and historical processes that can really then help strengthen theory so that theory can be relevant and useful towards these broader transformations. Thank you so much for being with us, Miguel. Have a
Lovely.
wonderful day.
Thank you very much.